Welcome to Biosimilars, What Patients and Caregivers Need to Know. I am Adam Koch, your moderator for this evening. I'm an IBD patient who was recently switched to a biosimilar medication and current co-chair of the Foundation's National Council of College Leaders. The National Council of College Leaders are a group that advocates and educates young IBD patients. Many IBD patients are receiving notifications from their insurance carriers about switching to a biosimilar. Patients may have concerns and questions about switching or starting a new medication. Tonight, we will aim to answer questions the IBD community has about biosimilars. I would like to thank tonight's sponsor, Amgen. Their support enables the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation and our partners to continue to provide important education for patients and caregivers. I want to welcome tonight's presenters. I'm excited to be joined today by Dr. Nidhi Malhotra, an adult gastroenterologist with Cary Gastroenterology Associates in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dr. Malhotra serves on the Foundation's National Scientific Advisory Committee as a member of the Patient Education Committee, and Dr. Angela Sandell, a pediatric gastroenterologist with the University of Rochester Medical Center. Dr. Sandell serves on the Foundation's National Scientific Advisory Committee as a member of the Advocacy Committee.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks for having us tonight.
Before we get started, let's go over a few quick pieces of housekeeping. The information provided during tonight's chat is meant for educational purposes only. It should not replace any advice you receive from your gastroenterologist, primary care provider, nutritionist, or surgeon. If you have any questions about your specific care, please reach out to your healthcare provider. If you have questions about your IBD unrelated to biosimilars, we won't be able to get to them tonight. To get your questions answered, you can contact our IBD Help Center by calling 1-888-MY-GUT-PAIN or emailing info@crohnscolitisfoundation.org. With that all said, let's get started. We asked our followers to send in questions in advance of today's discussion, and I will go around and ask our presenters to help answer these questions. First, we'll start with Dr. Malhotra. Let's start with the basic question. What exactly is a biosimilar?
Right, so Adam, so biosimilars are biological products that are highly similar to the reference product they were developed from, with minor differences in the clinically inactive components. Biosimilars are living protein constructs that are complex structures, some of which is similar to the reference product, the active portion, but the inactive portion may be slightly different. Biosimilars, similar to a biologic, are made in living cells. They take a long time to develop. And bottom line, there's clinically no meaningful difference between the biological product in terms of its safety, purity, and potency.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Sandell, this next question is for you. How are biosimilars similar and different from a biologic?
So biosimilars and biologics are very similar to each other, just like Dr. Malhotra said. And so the way that they're developed, again, is very complex. These molecules are large proteins, they're very intricate. And so it is nearly impossible because of their intricacy to make them identical. However, again, we'll reiterate the point that there is no clinically significant or meaningful difference in terms of the treatment of disease. So Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. So they're very similar in how well they work, how safe they are, and how well our body tolerates them. Some of the differences are that the biosimilar, so the medication that's derived from or similar to the reference product or the originator, it is different in the way that it's approved, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But because it's so similar in structure, we know that the safety is there and the efficacy is there. But because it can be approved a little bit faster, it is less expensive and therefore more accessible to patients.
All right, thank you. Dr. Malhotra, so are biosimilars considered generic medications?
So the short answer would be no. The longer part is, so generic is very simple construct, simple, relatively well-defined chemical structure, which means a generic can be easily replicated as a copy. They're stable, they don't require refrigeration. The process to approval is relatively quick, generally takes 2 to 3 years from factory to market for a generic. And although there is still a rigorous quality check in place, it's much less rigorous than that of a biosimilar. Biosimilar is not a generic. As I described earlier, and Dr. Sandell alluded to, it's a complex protein. So it goes through a rigorous process, first in the engineering, where it's made in living cells, and then during the regulatory process with the FDA for the actual approval to show that there's no meaningful difference between the active part of the biosimilar and the originator drug. And this process can take many years from factory to market for a biosimilar.
All right, thank you. And on that same note, Dr. Malhotra, we know that there are some biosimilars currently approved to treat IBD. Which ones are currently approved, and what is the FDA approval process like?
Right. So actually in the US, there's 28 approved biosimilars in different indications, but about half of them are currently commercially available. In the IBD world, there are 4 infliximab biosimilars that are approved, but 3 are currently on the market in the US. And for adalimumab, 6 are approved, but actually none are commercially available in the US. The three biosimilars for infliximab are Inflectra, Renaflexis, and Epsiola. The FDA approval process is pretty rigorous. You do have to prove clinical efficacy, but it's something called extrapolation, where you really just have to prove efficacy in one indication. So if the originator drug is approved across different indications, you do not necessarily have to show that efficacy across all different indications, but you do have to show efficacy across, at least across one indication. And then there is still post-marketing surveillance for safety and ongoing efficacy with the FDA. But because overall this process is a little bit shorter than the originator product, the cost to market is much lower than the originator product.
Thank you. And Dr. Sandell, which biosimilars are approved for pediatric IBD patients? And is the FDA approval process different for pediatric medications?
So the FDA approval process for pediatric medications is similar to that in adults. There is a pediatric assessment that must be done, but in terms of how the approval process goes, it's very similar to adults. For pediatrics in 2016, the FDA approved the infliximab biosimilars for the indications of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. So in pediatrics, currently the infliximab biosimilars that are available are approved, where the adalimumab biosimilars are not yet. And that's a function of when the indication for pediatric Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis were given for adalimumab, then there's a time period that we wait until they're available as a biosimilar product.
Thank you. Dr. Malhotra, is it safe to switch from a biologic to a biosimilar?
So the short answer is yes. You know, a lot of people get concerned about biosimilars because it's relatively new in the landscape. Majority of the patients have never heard of a biosimilar until they get a letter in the mail that they're being switched to the biosimilar because of the payer or the insurance company. So it's a new concept. It gets people, you know, the jitters, but safety wise, yes, it is safe to switch from the originator product to a biosimilar or from a biosimilar to another biosimilar. We'll kind of talk about it later in the talk or in our conversation, different definitions, but in answer to your question, yes, it is safe to switch from a biologic to its biosimilar.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, you mentioned that you can also switch from a biosimilar to another biosimilar. Can you speak a little bit more on that?
So the original studies looked at switching from the originator to the biosimilar. But if you think about the concept, it's same, right? The clinical, the active part of the protein in each biosimilar has the same mechanism of action as the originator or the reference drug. So technically, the efficacy of all the biosimilars is similar to the originator product. The safety profile is similar. The way we monitor response to the treatment is similar, using same bioassays for both therapeutic drug monitoring and antibody monitoring. And so, yes, you can technically switch from one biosimilar to another safely.
Thank you. Dr. Sandell, what about for pediatric IBD patients? Is it safe for children to take biosimilars or switch to one?
Absolutely. So very similarly to adults, we do think that it's safe and also just as effective to switch to a biosimilar. There are some stipulations that are supported for those switches. So the switches we believe should be if a patient, so let's say you're going from the biosimilar or from the reference product to the biosimilar or even vice versa, these switches we think are fine as long as it's a single switch. So in one direction, one time. And also the patient should be through their induction period. So if you've already started one medication like the originator or reference drug, then you should wait till you're through the induction period before making the switch. And then some other important points are we want to wait until the disease is under control to make the switch. So things should be in clinical remission. And then the last piece is that you have good levels of the drug in your body before making the switch. So that should be measured and they should be considered therapeutic at the time of the switch. So again, making a switch under those criteria or biosimilars we think are safe and effective if given as a new start. So you've never been on a biologic medication before, and the first thing that you start is a biosimilar, that in itself is safe and effective as well.
Thank you. Dr. Malhotra, can a pharmacy automatically substitute the biosimilar for the biologic without a patient's knowledge or consent?
Adam, before I answer that question, there's a couple definitions that I think our audience should be really well versed with. So one is transition or switching. Transition means a physician prescribes a biosimilar in place of the originator biologic product. Like Dr. Sandell said, the ideal times to make that switch would be either when you're initiating somebody for the first time, or once the induction has been completed, or when they're stable on their maintenance dosing with good therapeutic levels. That's called transition. Interchangeability is that same result clinically can be expected from the biosimilar as the originator product. So the risks are the same and no greater, and the efficacy is the same without any meaningful clinical differences. And this interchangeability is what's determined by the regulatory authority, which is FDA. And then what you are referring to is automatic substitution, where the pharmacist can dispense interchangeable biosimilar in place of the originator. And so when the initial FDA approval goes through, the FDA did not approve it this way. However, there's a lot of legislation in place or ongoing at this moment in different states. So it's a statewide legislation that determines that process. There are some states where it is actually legal to do so. Most states it's not. And that's why it's important to be involved in advocacy at the state level, because that's what really affects us as physicians, providers, and patients on a personal level. But in most states right now, automatic substitution, which is where the pharmacist can dispense without the provider's knowledge or consent, is not true.
Yeah, same in pediatrics right now. There is no FDA interchangeability approval at this point for biosimilars.
Thank you both. Dr. Sandell, would a patient's medication routine change if they switch to a biosimilar?
So no, so that's the great part. Because they're so similar or nearly identical, the interval and dose of the medication should be also similar. So if a patient is doing well on every 8-week dosing of infliximab and ultimately make a switch over to one of the infliximab biosimilars, they get to stay on their every 8-week dosing and shouldn't experience any difference in either efficacy or safety.
Thank you. Dr. Malhotra, what are biosimilars being adopted to, why are biosimilars being adopted by payers and healthcare systems for use in practice?
Right. So Adam, the eventual goal is overall savings in our healthcare system. The hope is that eventually the savings are trickled down to the patient, either in the form of lower premiums or just lower overall cost of the healthcare plan. So remember, although it's not that much cheaper to develop the biosimilar, it is cheaper for the regulatory process. The regulatory process is thorough, but slightly less involved than the originator, which makes the process cheaper. You already know for the biosimilar that the active ingredient works for the indication, and that's what leads to lower regulatory process. Therefore, the clinical cost and post-marketing costs of the biosimilar can be much lower. And so the thought is, if we have cheaper options for the same mechanism, same efficacy, and same risk profile, patients will have better access. And that really comes into play when we're trying to optimize medications, when it's really tough to get medications approved when a patient's on a originator drug and we want to change dosing per clinical response and we're unable to. The thought is cheaper access to these medications should help us in better access to the patients overall. So a lot of the times that's why payers and health systems are adopting the biosimilar route.
Thank you. Another question for you, Dr. Malhotra. What if patients really want to stay on their current medication? Do you recommend patients appeal? In what situations would you recommend an appeal?
So that's a toughie, right? Because I think the biggest reason, and there's actually studies that show that the reason patients want to stay on the originator is because that's what they're familiar with, right? The biosimilar is a new concept. And so new is always a little bit worrisome. You're not sure what you're getting into. So really understanding that the efficacy, the safety, the monitoring is the same. The few times I may help the patient do an appeal is, for example, if the patient is pregnant, I may not want to make a change while they're pregnant just because the originator has been studied extensively in pregnancy. That may be one of the times. And other times, maybe like Dr. Sandell mentioned, if a patient's mid-induction or we're still sort of adjusting their dosing during a flare and we're still optimizing medication, I may want to appeal to stay on the originator drug or to stay on the drug that they started on before making a switch. You really want to make a switch when the patient is stable and in remission. But really, the best thing to remember is that if we're just appealing because of our discomfort with the biosimilar, that can lead to treatment delays, right? We know appeals take a long time. The last thing you ever want is to miss a dose, to cause a flare, to cause loss of response or antibody formation. So that's what we don't want. We don't want to delay our treatment because of appeals, but in the right situation, in the couple scenarios I mentioned, that may be viable.
Thank you. And Dr. Sandell, same question, but with regards to pediatric patients. Do you recommend parents start an appeal process for their children?
So I think it's very similar, as we've been seeing kind of throughout this Facebook Live event. Similar ideas where you might not want to, or where you might want to appeal would be, again, if the patient is not having disease that's under control, just because that, part of the reason is if you're making a switch of the medication and, things don't go as you hoped, you wonder, could it have been because I made the switch or not? And as far as we know, that shouldn't be a reason for that, but certainly that could not sit well. So definitely wanting to make the switch when things are stable, when you have good drug levels. I'll just kind of repeat what Dr. Malhotra said, and not during an induction if you can avoid it, but when you're in a stable maintenance dosing. So very similar situations. And I think, I agree that, you don't want it to be just because of discomfort, but I totally understand that when you're doing well and you are, especially when you have not done well in the past and don't feel well, I can understand why that would seem concerning, but really here just to reassure that it should be okay as long as everything is stable.
Thank you. Dr. Malhotra, what advice do you have for patients who are being told to switch to a biosimilar?
So Adam, my biggest advice would be, remember, biosimilars have the same mechanism of action as the originator drug. There's no clinically meaningful differences between the originator and the biosimilar. So biosimilars are appropriate, they're safe, they're effective for the same indication as a reference product. They're used in the same clinical context. Like I said, the mechanism is the same. So really, that hesitancy, I think, is more so about the unknown and not so much about the actual mechanism. You really should be focusing, okay, it's the same mechanism, the efficacy really should be the same. The one thing to remember is biosimilar is not a different class of medication. So if you do have a prior history of non-response to the originator or you have antibodies to the reference product, this is not a new product. So I would not recommend that in those cases. And the best thing to remember is it's the same drug monitoring test, it's the same clinical activity assessments that are used to determine response. And so really biosimilars are safe for non-medical switches in IBD, as long as the patient is comfortable, as with more knowledge, and the provider is on board.
All right, thank you. And final question for Dr. Sandell. What advice do you have for parents who may be going through the process with their children or teens?
Yeah, I think the advice that I have would be that this is definitely something that should be done in close communication with your provider. I think of course, if you are told you have to make a switch, this might be something that feels rushed or uncomfortable, but I think, using shared decision-making, working with your provider, talking about the risks and benefits, that space is really important in the process for appeals or choosing not to appeal and to move forward. So I think just feeling comfortable in that space and really having that open conversation. I think your providers will want you to approach them about it and will want to be informed. And sometimes they may not even know that switch is coming. You might be the first one that's told that's going to be needed. And so just really staying in close communication is important.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Dr. Malhotra and Dr. Sandell, for taking the time to help us better understand biosimilars this evening. If you have any questions about biosimilars that were not answered tonight, please visit the Foundation's website at crohnscolitisfoundation.org. You can also contact our IBD Help Center by calling 1-888-MY-GUT-PAIN or emailing info@crohnscolitisfoundation.org. I would like to thank tonight's sponsor again, Amgen. If you enjoyed this session and learned valuable information, we hope you will share the recording, which will be available on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, with all those you know who are either battling IBD or are a loved one of someone with IBD. We want to continue to serve the IBD community with programs like this and other critical education that our patients need now more than ever. Thank you and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.